Hello, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Staffan Lindberg from the University of Gothenburg. He is the director of the Varieties of Democracy, the V-Dem project, and today we will have the real opportunity to have him to present the last report published on 2024, and then we could discuss the outcomes and the consequences, the implicancies of this data he will present today. This event is co-organized by the Graduate Institute and the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy. We are launching also a series of events this year on who is voting in 2024. We have a big year of elections. In this framework, this week, we published the first episode of the podcast Who is Voting in 2024, and we will have many more activities during the year. Thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me here. Thanks for being here. Yes, V-Dem Democracy Report 2024 builds on 31 million data, input from over 4,200 scholars and other experts from over 180 countries. So whatever you see here summarizing that in this year's report, it's not white men in their 50s like myself that decide how democratic different countries are. It's just important to have that with you before you start with your critical questions. Anyway, so this year's report, democracy winning and losing at the ballot. Winning because, as we've seen very recently, democracy has been winning at the ballot. Brazil, Poland, but also losing. We know for many years now that autocratization, or backsliding if you like, typically starts with leaders and parties coming into power in relatively democratic elections and then undermine democracy. And democracy also being defeated completely and authoritarianism solidified by elections, recently in Russia. So there are these contrasting trends, and in this year's report, click, 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 no? In this year's report, at least, there are 5 parts. Yeah, now it's coming. There are 5 parts. I'm going to give you some quick highlights from all the 5 parts. And there are some hard copies. If you're a lucky one, you have a hard copy. Otherwise, you may find it somewhere. Democracy in the world, where are we at? Well, you can look at this different ways, right? We'll take our liberal democracy index. This last 50 years can look like this. Oh, there was a democratization there. We all know that third wave of democratization, starting with, on this day, today it's a 50-year celebration of what? Shh. Okay. Right. What? The Carnation Revolution, right? 25th of April. 1974. And then democracy spread in the world. We know that story. And now declining. But you see this liberal democracy index is sort of not that much of a dent there. And if you draw a red line back, where it was maybe 20 years back, but it's within confidence intervals, that's the country-based averages. It's also a way of weighting. That you give equal weight in how much democracy there is in the world. You give equal weight to Seychelles with 90,000 inhabitants out there in the Indian Ocean as to India with 1.4 billion people, a huge economy, huge influence on the world. One can debate whether that Seychelles, in terms of how much democracy there is in the world, if Seychelles really means as much for the world as India, or China, or Brazil, or United States. So we can weigh the same underlying data by population size. So you can think of this, and then you see, okay, we had a wave of democratization, and now this downward trend, much more stark. And you can think of that average as sort of the level of democracy enjoyed by some imaginary global average citizen. Can weigh it by territory, also then the sliding down is more pronounced, not as much as with the population weighted, but it still indicates that a lot of the backsliding or autocratization in the world goes on in countries with large populations and big territories. And economy. This is by GDP, okay? So you can think of this as saying something about how much democracy is losing out in the world in terms of economic power. It's not a pretty picture. We wrote more about that in last year's report. If you're interested in that, you can download that on the website. We pay a lot of attention on the population-weighted measure because democracy is ruled by the people. Hence, it matters how many people are affected, have a certain level of democracy. By that measure, at least 15 years of very dramatic decline in the world. Freedom House talk about 18 years. I'll show some metrics that say, okay, maybe it's been going on for 30 years. It's been going on for a while, put it mildly. We can look at this from different perspectives, also in terms of sort of taking the same underlying data and aggregating it up into more sort of cores, more boxes of different types of regimes. We have sort of closed dictatorships, the worst ones. We have electoral autocracies. Think everything from Putin's Russia, where you have multi-party elections and media freedom on paper, but not much more, to sort of India, Hungary, where you have really multi-party elections, and they are not too bad, but a lot of other things with media freedom and civil society and so on is not free and fair enough for them to classify anymore as democracies. And then you have electoral democracies where things are okay, and liberal democracies with all the sort of freedoms and all that. And then in that perspective, we're talking about maybe at least 10, 15 years where the number of electoral autocracies have been going down, number of closed dictatorships going up. So autocracies becoming worse. And at the same time, number of electoral democracies going up and number of liberal democracies going down. Democracies becoming less democratic. So there's two parallel trends underlying this overall thing. It's not only about what we call democratic backsliding, which is sort of democracies getting less democratic, but still are democracies. It's also a lot of autocracies that are getting worse. Here we can look at this from the population perspective, same categories, same 50 years, and then we're talking about at least 20 years when the share of the world population has been increasing in different types of autocracies, right? Now 71% of the world population by our count live in non-democracies. And we know for a long time, we've known that when countries autocratize, freedom of expression, writ large, and especially media freedom, where are the journalists? You were here somewhere. There you are attacked first, and often the most. But now we see a new trend in this year's report that elections are also being undermined in many more countries than before. It's sort of a sign for us that these wannabe dictators and the ones that have already started to become such, they are feeling more and more confident also to attack that core institution of democracy, elections. Here's a visual of that. So this is 10 years ago. 10 years ago, looking at different components of democracy, you have different here. So freedom of expression and freedom of association and different parts or components of democracy, indices for that. If you're above this diagonal line, then it's becoming better in more countries than it's getting worse. Very simple metric. All change is statistically significant, of course. Most things were still getting better in more countries than getting worse 10 years ago. Clean elections getting better in 23 countries, getting worse in only 10 at that time, 10 years ago. Compare that to end of 2023. Boom. Right. Falling down below the line. Worst of all, their freedom of expression, but now also clean elections has moved down and out here, getting worse in 23 countries and getting better in only a dozen. So it's sort of a 180-degree flip, right, in 10 years. And that's a new trend with the elections. Okay. We have right now 60 countries in the data that we can certify are in an episode of regime transformation, either getting better or getting worse. Out of the 60, unfortunately, 42 are in episodes of autocratization. The data looks like this. Here's the last 50 years again. And this, you know, Achim, when we were happy here in the mid-90s, and there were 70 countries at the same time, moving ahead of, moving ahead, right? Frank Fukuyama wrote The End of History, right? And we almost believed that, right? Boom, down to 18 now. And that, we can discuss if it started already here or here, but sort of at least these last 20, 25 years, the number of countries autocratizing going up. Now 42 at our last count. There's a little dip there, a little uptick. Could be interpreted as a sign of the wave has crested. We're very careful not to say that, because with this methodology we use, the ERT, Episodes of Regime Transformation, you can read about that. There are papers on that in journal Peace Research last year. We're very conservative with saying that we know now statistically significant and certified this country is in an episode. So some countries have started to slide down here in the last few years, but they're not really sort of fulfilled the criteria of the methodology to classify as autocratizers. There are 25 what we call near misses. They're close to reaching the threshold. But so even if just a handful of those in the next few years qualify, these numbers will increase. It's all over the world. It's a global wave. It's not one region, one part. It's all over the world. And now more than a third of the world's population live in countries that are autocratizing, moving in the wrong direction. The 42 countries up from 11 just a few years ago. So it is, and I think this perspective is also important, right? I mean, some of the countries, as I talked about, you have autocracies that are getting worse. But out of these 42 that are right now in an episode, 28 were democracies when the episode started. Only half of them remain democracies today. So the fatality rate is pretty high if you're a democracy and start to autocratize. But we're learning new things. And this new ERT methodology that we're using this year for the first time for the democracy report also makes it possible for us to see different patterns in how autocratization unfolds. So we have the sort of what we used to sort of think about autocratization as standalone. Sort of think India, so democracies, and then Modi comes and it goes down, right? But then we have bell turn autocratization. So think of it as failed democratization. You had an episode of democratization, things were going up, and then that process was broken and turned around, in sort of in one process. And we have many reasons to believe that these different types of processes have different sources or drivers, and maybe also different cures, if you like. So that's a research agenda going forward. Here is the top 10 list you don't want to be on. Top 10 of standalone autocratizers going on right now, still ongoing. I don't know if you can see, you brought your binoculars there in the back, but it's Greece, Poland, Mauritius, Hungary, India. So you can see they started at very different levels, and they've also ended up at very different levels, but 8 out of the 10 are autocracies now. That's even a higher fatality rate, right? Only now we hope Poland is turning around. And then we have this bell turn autocratization, and they also, this is the top 10 list of the bell turns ongoing right now. Again, starting at very different levels, reaching different levels. Country like South Korea staying a democracy, and some countries along with that, Armenia and Indonesia still, but others falling back into autocracy, right? And they are in very different contexts, start at very different levels, end at very different levels, but they all have this U-shaped term. And the question, of course, is what happened that turned these things around, right? Because if we can figure that out, we can also figure out, okay, what can we do to stop these things from happening? What can we help democratization to succeed? And there's some good news, right? We have to have some good news, right? They are democratizing countries. Oh, sorry, that was the election. Sorry, okay. Yes, there's some democratizing countries, and but fewer and fewer, fortunately. It's only 5% of the world population, and about half of that is Brazil. So thank you, Brazil, but the other countries, they tend to be small, right? Democratizing countries right now are very small countries. Same here, we've also sort of been able to decipher these standalone versus the U-turns. And the U-turns are really interesting because they are sort of stopping autocratization and turning it around, right? What is the magic bullet or the bullets? Sorry for the here the piece, but yeah. What are the key factors, right, that make that happen? So we have democratization this year is 9. Everything is 9. There are only 9 standalone ongoing right now. There are also 9 U-turns, and there are 9 near misses. So everything is 9. So here you see that all of them have become one or the other form of democracy. Most of them are electoral democracies, and Seychelles, liberal democracy. So that's good. Some are really quick. Fiji and Honduras, right? Others have been going on for a long time, like in the Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste even more, of course. And the U-turn democratizers are really, I mean, we have Zambia, right, that turned around against all odds. We thought it was like gone. But with lots of popular mobilization, opposition parties uniting, international community supporting, and the judicial system eventually playing a part, Zambia turned around. Brazil has been turning around, Lesotho, Maldives, and so on. Some of them are a bit shaky, right? Thailand. Well, it was an election that, 11% voted in, and there's now a parliament. That's basically the difference here. That's why there's an uptick. We'll see about that. We've looked at all those U-turns, though, in an academic paper that's now under review. So it's a working paper still, but we looked at all episodes of U-turns from 1900 on to the present. And I was amazed that about half of all autocratization episodes became U-turns. It's much, much more than I thought. And that percentage has even increased here towards the present period. And that for me is a sign of hope, right? that not only can countries go down, and most of them do go down to electoral autocracy, it's not everything is lost, right? If you manage to help turn things around within 2, 3, 4 years, that's possible, right? And then just my final minute here. I have to say something about this year of election. Everybody talk about it. We know it's the largest share of the world population, largest number of countries ever going to elections. A lot of people have been talking about it as a make or break year for democracy in the world. And we can put a perspective of this that, for me, makes this even worse. And it looks like this. We have 60 countries in the V-Dem data set that are among the ones that go to elections this year. 31 are in autocratizing contexts, where elections can be used to either further that or help turn things around. And only 3 are democratizing countries. The details like this, so you have these standalone and bell turns, and then these near misses, 11 cases that are really sort of critical, right? Where it's sort of almost a watershed whether they're going to end up in these real autocratization cases or not. And then, of course, this category of other is where we don't have any statistically sort of meaningful changes in the last few years. Doesn't mean that the elections don't mean anything. To give you one example, the United States is in that category. If Trump comes back into power, I'm on the record with Washington Post and others, so I may as well say it here, also to Geneva Times, was it? If Trump comes back into power, democracy in the United States will not survive that. And you can think about the ramifications of that. Okay, thank you. That was the Democracy Report 2024. It's all available on the website, including also you can download and play around with 31 million data if you like. If you don't like to do that, and your friend is not R, then you have other friends and a life, then we have these online tools, so you can access all of the data, create your own graphs, download them, use them for whatever purposes you like. And on that note, let me say thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Staffan, for this presentation. Not very optimistic, let's say, but...
I try to smile every now and then.
You try to smile, yeah. You did a good job presenting the data. Now we have some time to exchange between us before opening the room. And yeah, I also had in mind to mention the Carnation Revolution, the Portugal event, because it's a very important event for Europe and for democracy. It started with the transitions, also in Latin America. We have this trend, but also to put time in the conversation. But before going to that, I want to ask you a question related to how do you define the general presentation of the data. In the index, you have many indicators. We can see that in the website. And in a given moment, in a country, we can see up and downs in different levels. In some countries, could be an improvement in freedom of expression, and then a deterioration in other indicator. But at the end of the day, let's say you organize all the countries in a spectrum going from closed autocracies to liberal democracies. And my question is, to what extent this is really catching our understanding on democracies? A decline in some indicators not necessarily mean autocratization. And to provide an example, in the report in 2023, Uruguay appeared as an autocratizer, which produces a lot of debate in the country because it was a clear signal. Well, it's always controversial, but there was a signal of some deterioration. But does always some deterioration means autocratization? Or maybe we need to understand it in alternative or complementary ways.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to recognize is that any measurement of the world, any aspect of the world, is in the end a simplification, right? A reduction of. The only thing that's not a reduction of reality is reality itself, right? So, even the most qualitative, in-depth account, if you write a book about the last 2 years in Uruguay, it's still a simplification, right? So there are levels in hell, as we say, right? And then, our indices, and point that out, the index that's used for the democracy report and most often, or the index that's used most often in research measuring democracy is the liberal democracy index. But we have electoral democracy index, we have egalitarian democracy index, we have the participatory, capturing different aspects. And then there are occasions where a country, and I should also say that we have in total, I think, about 600 indicators now. But the Liberal Democracy Index, for example, builds on 48 key indicators for liberal democracy. That's aggregated up. So there are a lot of aspects that have to do with democracy, depending on your view of democracy, that don't go into a specific index, but there is data for. And there are occasions when a country some indicators go up, harassment, harassment of journalists becoming worse, but the legislature's checks on the executive is becoming better. But it's pretty rare that sort of things going in different directions over a number of years continue. If a country starts to move down or democratize, then eventually several indicators start to pick up that and it spreads. And with this new ERT methodology that we're using from this year, it is a bit more conservative, more in a sort of academic sense, not political sense. It's not right wing or anything. We want to be very certain about a country before we classify it as an autocratizer or democratizer.
Okay, fair enough. But then it's also the question again with the definition and the way to approach it. As a political scientist, I use a lot the data, and we appreciate this. It's open, accessible, very complete, with a relevant time series. So it's really a very good product for all researchers around the world. And as you said, there is always controversy around the definitions, etc., etc. And now a second point I have in mind relates to time. I mean, representative democracies are quite new, are historically constructed and are in construction. It's dynamic to somehow, but at the same time we all know that, but the approach is as if there were an universal and definitive thing, and in front of that democracies are evaluated, and then you are taking a picture each year. So there are several questions included in this question, but is to what extent, for instance, elections are enough to capture what a democracy is and these declines, and to what extent maybe there are some things that are missing in the way to approach.
Yeah, I think there are always things missing, so we can agree on that. We take we take sort of a universalistic approach. We take sort of a UN Declaration of Human Rights approach to democracy. As one standard, one bar, one set of criteria, same for all countries, same over time. Then people can think whatever they like, but that's how we measure it. And the reason for that is mostly sort of, fundamentally was, when we set out to do that, was comparability, right? For academic, scientific purposes, we need comparable measures. We can't have like one metric of GDP per capita for 1980 to 1990, and then a different metric from 1991, right? Then we sort of break the time series and we can't study it. So fundamentally it was about comparability. Get measures that are comparable across time and space, based on a certain definition. But even the electoral democracy, which is the most narrow democracy index we provide, even that is fairly broad in sort of democratic theory. It's very Robert Dahl, polyarchy. So yeah, elections are important, but the elected people also must have power, right? And then beyond those elections and people being able to vote and people being able to run in the elections and form political parties and all that, you need to have the broader context of freedom of expression, alternative source of information, that's media freedom, right? And then associational freedoms, fully civil society free and all that, right? So it is fairly broad beyond elections even there.
Yeah, thanks. And then connecting this question to the political implications, because, yeah, you have comparability, and this is very useful. We can see the trends, the general trends, the regional trends, etc., etc. But then what happens with the ability to capture what's going on in a country? Let's take, for instance, the case of Chile, that qualified as one of the best democracies in Latin America and in general, but then something was going wrong in the country and was the upheaval in 2019. To what extent an indicator like V-Dem can capture this kind of...
Yeah, it's limited depending on what happens, and the events in Chile were not captured at all almost in the electoral or the liberal democracy index. Shows some changes in the participatory deliberative aspects. Same in the United States in the lead up to Trump taking over and then his first years in power. A lot of the deliberative indicators just dive, right? The liberal democracy is sort of sliding down a little bit, but not that much, and has to do with the legislature mostly, not functioning as a executive with checks and balances institution. So it depends a little bit, and yes, it's very careful. I mean, it's very important if you use our liberal democracy index or another democracy index to look at what the definition we use is and what the indicators that go into that index are, so that you know what it measures and what it doesn't measure, right? Of course, yes.
Yes, thank you. And now a last question before opening the room, because I'm sure everybody here will have additional questions. It's about the political implications. You already spoke about the 2024 elections. The whole picture, as we said, is quite pessimistic. Where do you think should, international organizations, civil society associations, etc., invest to defend democracies?
Where they should invest?
To defend democracies or to protect democracies?
Yeah. I guess there are more than one way to answer that question, of course. And so one thing we see very clearly, if we just think about the democracy promotion community and not so much the whole international community, but democracy promotion and protection community, there's more and more talk of democracy protection as an alternative to democracy promotion. I think that's That's very important. What we see clearly in the data and in recent analysis on different, they call it different things. People call it resilience sometimes, even if it means stopping autocratization and turning it around. But, okay, we know that certain institutions often are critical. The judiciary, in many instances of the U-turns, have been really important in being that last bulwark against autocratization. We saw that really important in Brazil as well. It was really important in the United States after the last elections. Think about if the judiciary had caved in for the Trumpistas' claim of election fraud, right? And ruled politically rather than on the facts. So supporting, but it's a tricky thing, right? Supporting the judiciary to withstand and be able to help stop autocratization. Think about it in programmatic terms. Like democracy promotion that's easy, right? We've been doing that since the 1990s. It's like train judges and other parts of the judiciary in like women's rights and access to justice and make it sort of, and in children's rights, LGBTIQ rights, and do things better, right? Democracy protection would be programming to train and support the judiciary to defend itself from the executive. How popular is that in bilateral agreements with these guys in power? So it's a different ball game, right? Another thing that we see, another institution that both in sort of the turning around and in the successful autocratization, a key sort of dividing line there is the autonomy of the electoral management body. It goes along the same line, autonomy from the executive, staying independent. And that independence played a critical role in many of the U-turns, but that autonomy was taken away when countries successfully autocratized. So there are certain institutions that can be strengthened and actors supporting them around these institutions, of course. And then I don't know with the political implications. I think everybody should know that we know that a world that continues to autocratize and we get more autocracies, or turn it around, we get fewer sort of high-quality democracies, is going to mean a world with more wars and more domestic militarized conflict. We know that. Democracies, high-quality democracies, don't fight wars with each other. They do fight wars with others, but not with each other. So the fewer of those democracies we have, the more countries that can fight with each other. There's also more civil militarized conflict in those that are not democracies. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not surprising from that point of view. And there will be more of that sort of thing if the world continues like this.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for...
Any more fun things I can talk?
Now we can open the room for questions. Do we have a
Yes,
micro?
I saw somebody there.
Okay, we can take... yeah, we have here one more.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Massioni. I'm a student here at the Institute. I heard a former head of state about 12 or 18 months ago say in an interview that he still sees the United States as the shining castle on top of the hill when it comes to democracy. I'm curious, do you agree with that comment? If not, who do you see as the shining castle on top of the hill? Who can the rest of the world look to as a model? And I was also curious, can you also elaborate on your closing statement regarding Trump's reelection and American democracy surviving?
Which take 3 or 4, okay?
Okay, you want to take more than
Yeah.
one? Okay.
Yeah, we take several because I see many hands and. Sorry.
No, more than 3.
Okay.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tormod Andresen. I'm Norway's ambassador to the UN, and as such, I consider myself a small soldier on the front line in the struggle of ideas and norms that underpin democracy. And we're not doing all that well, like you have set out, Professor. I'm grateful to you and to the Graduate Institute for making me able to learn. My question is, in the current reality, it seems a bit tone deaf to say democracy is the only way forward. We need to put forward some good arguments, and that is difficult, not least because some democracies are not performing well, while autocracies, some of them are performing quite okay, not least in economic terms. So what is, in 2024, the best argument for democracy? The way I use quite a bit is stability within states, because only democracy, only some kind of governance that sort of reflects different interests in the country can provide over time stable governance. And I think you also said less wars, right? So this stability in and among states is a good argument. But are there any other arguments that you can help me add to my speaking points? Thank you.
We take one more and then one more, please.
Hi, I'm Shefali. I'm also a student at the Graduate Institute. I was going through your report and I saw that a few different indicators that you've taken is, say, gender and electoral quotas for gender. But what about youth, specifically as a socioeconomic group? Because given the world's largest elections, there's also the largest youth vote coming out for the first time, right? And the youth can make a big difference. They've made it in, like, the case of Biden with 2020 in the US, and also 2014 with India. So just wanted to know your perspective on, say, demographic dividends and democracy.
All right. Let's start from the back. That's a blind spot in V-Dem's measurement. We don't have separate measures for youth. We are doing better on gender, not perfect, but and so on. But we don't have. It's one of the things we discussed to measure, but left outside eventually. We had to make some hard choices. So unfortunately, yeah, I'm sorry. Guilty as charged. We produced a report last year that we launched ahead of this Summit for Democracy. The second Summit for Democracy last year. It's called The Case for Democracy. It's also available on the website. War is one thing. What's the argument for democracy? I think I'll try and make it very short so we have time for more questions. But you can read that report. It summarizes the instrumental reasons, as far as we know from scientific literature. What are the dividends of democracy? We should not forget the intrinsic reason. Democracy is the only political system that we know of that empirically can show that strives to respect and preserve human dignity and choice. To live under the laws of your own choosing. I mean, it's to some extent at least, as a group. It's the only system that does that, or seeks to do that. And there's great overlap between democratic rights and human rights. And they build on the same foundational principle, which is that we have equal worth as human beings. So that's the intrinsic. Instrumentally, democracies are better at economic growth. There are a couple of exceptions, Singapore, China, the last 25 years. It's not looking that good now. But on average, the track record of autocracies in terms of producing economic growth is terrible. you're much more likely as an autocracy to end up like DRC than Singapore, right? Democracies are also better at using that growth. For example, social protection schemes. Murshid et al. Has showed with his big team that if you go from a bad dictatorship to a good democracy, on average, actual spending on social protection schemes increase by over 100%. Human development, on average, going from dictatorship to democracy, a country reduces infant mortality with 94%. 94% on average, right? We can go down the line. Safe water, electricity, internet provision, these public goods, democracies do much better. And then, of course, people don't always feel that in a short sort of electoral or having we can discuss why that is. But the track record is pretty clear from the scientific literature. Coming back now, I'm not making it short. I will try. You will suffer. Okay. No, United States has never been this beacon of democracy. I mean, it's a sort of an American folk tale or something. They also have this idea that they became a democracy in 1776 or something like that, or shortly thereafter, which is also a fairy tale. By our measure, they became sort of a good democracy around 1970, after the civil rights movement and ending of de facto apartheid in the South. So it's a fairly young democracy. It's a very peculiar democracy in so many ways. And the famous Italian political scientist Giovanni Sartori, he said democracy in the United States works not thanks to, but despite the Constitution. And it works only because Americans want it to work. And now they kind of, at least a portion of them, stopped wanting that, right? So that's why I'm not so optimistic. So I don't think, what are the big, I think, democracy can work and live and thrive in very different cultural contexts and look and sort of de facto work, as long as we have these sort of minimum benchmarks there, right, with the elections and freedom of expression and association and things, right? But then they can be very, very different. Of course, I'm from Sweden. We are perfect. No, of course not, right? And Switzerland and so on, right? But those are good. I mean, Taiwan right now is great in so many ways. Like Seychelles, go to the Seychelles. Democracy is brilliant, right? So there are very many different contexts where it can work as long as we have these. And then there are varieties of good democracies as well, not one model.
I think we have more questions here. And meanwhile, I can say that this is interesting because the US qualified as democracy more or less at the same time in which was promoting dictatorships in many countries, in Latin America and around the world.
Yes,
so the democratic promotion side is like absolutely the opposite. No? It's like strongly promoting autocratization, at least in Chile and other countries. It's like,
during the Cold War, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. Arthur Dahl, the Global Governance Forum. Have you looked at any correlation between what you've seen in these trends in democracy and an economic system that increases or decreases inequality in the country? It often seems that when a larger percentage of the population doesn't see any benefit from the economy, that push them to look for something other than democracy as a solution. So have you explored that correlation? Thank you.
We take 3 again. Yeah. People is far away.
Yeah, we have to get some gender balance.
So my name is Azra, and I'm from Indonesia. We just had our voting. But what I'm about to ask is about, it was interesting the point that you mentioned earlier about Chile and the fact that the United States labeled itself as like the champion of democracy, but also supporting the, the fact that there is an existence of autocracy, like in Indonesia, for example. I can speak for Suharto, and I think you mentioned it as well in your report. So, but the thing is, like, again, as mentioned before, the United States was behind all of this. Even like in Indonesia, IMF, CIA was heavily involved, and it was literally stated on the declassified documents that is posted in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the United States itself. And I feel like the more I learn, because I just did an essay on this, the more I learn, I feel like I have a decrease in confidence at the current form of democracy, because Suharto, there's a nostalgia currently among the populations in Indonesia that we think that it was better during Suharto leading the country, economic-wise, mortality of like infants and everything. So I was just wanting to ask, because there is a research here says that we need to renew the form of democracy, but he doesn't elaborate it that much. So I was just kind of like wondering, in your opinion, how should we kind of like renew that democracy, especially Indonesia, like a lot of them like literally thinking that Suharto was a hero even. So that just proves how much democracy in Indonesia is kind of like failing and just kind of like, killing the hope of like literally being free, because as you mentioned in the report as well, Indonesia is partly free. So I'm just kind of like wondering, how can we, quote unquote, renew this democracy? Thank you. I think it's just kind of like following up on the gentleman's questions.
And one more, yeah.
Excuse me.
Yes, so first of all, thank you for the presentation, extremely interesting. And my question is on the relationship between autocratization and geopolitics. The title of your presentation is Global Governance. And you've shown one of the links, which is the fact that you have a deterioration situation, you have less high-quality democracies, increases the probability of conflicts, both internal and international. But I would like to ask a question in the other sense. The fact that you have a deteriorating geopolitical global environment, increasing tensions, etc. Does this have an impact on democratic trends inside the country? So in the other direction. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go in the right order here. Inequality. Yes, the evidence is very clear, at least for the post-World War II period and onward, sort of on average, democracies are not better than autocracies in addressing socioeconomic inequality. Why that is the case, which is sort of counterintuitive and counter the theory, there are different ideas about. But the fact of the matter is there. And you can put in there maybe that we have had, more than 50 years now since the invention of Thatcherism and Reaganomics, a long period, and then, of course, exporting that through the Washington Consensus and the structural adjustment programs to the Global South, that with not only globalization, of course, but a liberalization in economic terms, that has, among other things, led to record levels all across the world in terms of relative economic inequalities. There is also increasing evidence then at the micro level, both survey but also experimental work. Most of the evidence is sort of Europe writ large, not only EU, but Europe writ large and North American, but okay, that people who experience being victims of that increase in relative inequality are the ones voting for the right-wing nationalist reactionary political parties and leaders that are then undermining democracy if and when they come into power. And that's not a political statement. I just want to make that clear. It's not a political statement. That's a factual statement. The last 30 years of autocratization is almost exclusively. There are a couple of exceptions, Mexico right now being one. But other than that, it's right-wing, nationalist, reactionary parties and leaders. This wave. 60s and 70s, there were a lot of left-wing that took away democracy, right, in one-party states and that sort of stuff. So it doesn't have to be that way, but that's the case now. Yeah, we have Indonesia. Yes. You should come with that solution. You're the young brains that haven't stiffened and in their ways like mine. You have the agility and the creativity to come up with these ideas. You're also the coming generations that should shape the future, right? The only thing I would caution in that is that I don't think that should involve getting rid of the known institutions that are requisite for democracy. It should involve building additions to it, right? And then, as your comment reflected, we should not, like, even if we in the room here, maybe, I don't know everyone, but I'm guessing that most in here are sort of pro-democratic and pro-human rights and like that. But history shows that dictators can be very popular, right? We don't know the extent to which Putin is still popular, but he was very popular. We know that for a very long time, even when he was taking Russia into dictatorship. Jerry Rawlings, when he took power in his second coup in Ghana in 1981 on 31st December, that's a good day to make a coup, right? Everybody's drunk and at home. So they were 30 people who took over the country. But, you know, they called him Junior Jesus, right? And then when went for multi-party democracy in the 90s, he won 2 elections in a row, square and fair, with 2/3 majority. He was very popular, right? Of course, dictators can be popular. Democracy is not everyone's favorite system of government all the time, everywhere, right? Multilateral geopolitics beyond. I think the current development is unfortunate, of course, with the increasing sort of conflictual situation between more and more democracies on the one hand and autocracies on the other. And that includes increasingly also Gulf states like Saudi Arabia that are undermining democracy and have been for also 35, 40 years in their own way. But that conflict makes it more and more difficult to in a similar way as during the Cold War, to promote democracy and to further and nurture democracy. So you have countries like India that are really sort of, we don't classify it as a democracy anymore. Some say it's a hybrid or flawed or whatever. Like, it's gone from relatively okay to relatively not okay, that sort of thing. And then the democratic part of the world are like, okay, we don't want to push India even more into the arms of Putin, right? They've already increased their trade with Putin's Russia enormously, right? We don't want to push those fence sitters away from us, right? And then how do you do that without being completely just a big liar and all that? And then we have to recognize that in that international politics, right, there are other things than democracy that count, right? Trade and economic power and alliances and God knows what. And that's the reality. But it makes it more difficult to be sort of put, for countries, I think, to put democracy high on the foreign policy agenda and hold the banner high, right? So I see the future also being more difficult for the actors here in Geneva and other places who want to further democracy and human rights. The space for doing that is also shrinking, right? As a consequence of, unfortunately. That makes it more important to work with it, including Norway, right? Good.
Okay, our time is over, so I would like to thank you again for the information you collect at V-Dem, this data, which is very useful and relevant for our conversation, and also to take the time and come to Geneva to discuss with us your outcomes and your thoughts. As we have seen, is a very alive debate on the drivers of democracy, democratization and autocratization, and it's very important to have this kind of feedbacks to proceed with these reflections. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me.